So without further ado, Juliet Hills, I think most of you know her, will present her talk. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Coming, it's nice to see friends and nice to see new people as well. You will see this is clearly not John, this is his dad, this is Patrick Cudahy, and there's a nice portrait of John on the sign there, and next to it a map of Ireland, and next to it a photograph of John's son, Patrick's grandson. When I first came here, there were a lot of Cudahys floating about, and I didn't know who was who. Then I worked at the Historical Society, and now I know, got them all sorted out, at least the local ones. There's an awful lot of them. So, we'll need to get that picture back. Okay, good. So you've got a timeline in your hands, most of you, that gives you the years and so on. Now, it's interesting that the Wikipedia article on John Cudahy misses 15 years of his life. So that's fascinating to me why they would miss that out, and I don't know who wrote it, and I'm not the sort of person who would wade in and try and add to a Wikipedia article. But if anybody else wants to do it, they're welcome to my notes. So I'll start with Patrick. He was born in 1849. You may know that he came here as a babe in arms when he was only 3 months old, and it took 3 months to get here across the water from Ireland. He died in 1919, you'll see that, I think, in the notes. He was one of 7 children. When they moved around all over the place, they didn't have any money, they were scratching about for a living, got a lot of different jobs at their school very young, and at some point they lived in Cudahy Woods, which is along what is now called College Avenue, and it's the airport runway crosses the road down there. It's by Melvin Mulch, where I get my garden supplies. And in Cudahy Woods, Patrick's mother scared a bear away by snapping a towel. So we're covering a lot of ground here. You're going to be, let me see how to on the front of my folder. We're going to be visiting, I haven't got a list of all the, no, I haven't. We're going to be visiting a lot of countries in this talk. Starting with Ireland. So Patrick married Anna Magden, who was born in Merton, and then he was involved in the Cudahy, Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. His will is in the Milwaukee County Historical Society collection. His son Michael F., who was John's brother, got 6/15 of the Cudahy brothers' corporate shares. John, our hero, got 4/15. And 5/15 went to each of his 5 daughters, Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, Edith, and Irene. 7,600 acres of timber in British Columbia went to his partner, William Lewis, and 5/8 of an interest in that went to John. Patrick Cudahy's desk from his office in the meatpacking plant in Cudahy was in the Cudahy Historical Society building, which is an old railroad depot that was served the Cudahy plant for a while. And so on that desk is a ledger, and if you leaf through it, you'll see payments to his son John were taking care of business in various places, including British Columbia, which is exciting for me because that's where my cousins live. And so you can see dividends paid to him. Now, Patrick was a member of the Old Settlers Club. Do this without hitting the microphone. Here is a menu from a banquet from 1896 from the Historical Society. That's Dr. Walcott on the front. That's the statue in Lake Park. You know that statue? Go to Lake Park Mondays. And some of the people that were at that banquet were famous names in this area. You may know streets named after some of these people. On the south side, Chase, Tesh, Siver, Thompson, Trowbridge, Whitnall. Other people who were there were Dr. Kemper, the Kieckhoffers, Fred Koenig, Hawley Road. Hawley Road you've heard of. I wasn't expecting that to happen. It's supposed to be at my level already. Estabrook Chapman, who had a store downtown, Dousman Durwood, who's taught English at the seminary, Beecher, Mabbitt, Meineke, John Mitchell, John Lendrum Mitchell, that is Alexander's son, and Billy Mitchell's grandfather. Monkwitz, Pritzlaff, Plankington, Pabst, you've heard of Pabst, everybody's heard of Pabst, and Ogden, right outside the door. So those were some of the big wigs in 1896 who were at that banquet. So one of the things that Patrick and his wife did was travel the world because he was so wealthy, and that his obituary of him and his widow, they're both available online. You can find there's a wonderful site called Find a Grave. And if you think of a famous person or even somebody you know and you think, I wonder where they're buried, if you go to Find a Grave, you'll find them. That's a wonderful website to know about if you're interested in history. And I just discovered 2 days ago that Michael J. Cudahy, the one on the front of the book, when he died 18 months ago, I called Feerick Funeral Home to find out where he was buried, and they wouldn't tell me. So I thought, well, this is, maybe he made enemies, he didn't want anybody to dig him up, I don't know. Anyway, we've now discovered that he's actually buried at Forest Home, which is unusual because the rest of the family, as you're going to see, is at Calvary because that's the Catholic burial site. So one of the city's founders is at Calvary because he was Catholic. You know who that was? Juno, French Catholic, right? 1818 was the first year-round house that he built. And so some of you have a photograph of a room with animal heads all around the top. This was an exhibit, this is the original room, but there was an exhibit at the Historical Society based on this room that Michael Cudahy put in memory of his dad into the Historical Society. And so when I was working there as a volunteer 12 years ago, I asked the archivist, why is that room called the Cudahy Library? And he said, oh, there's a story behind that. Michael Cudahy wanted to commemorate his father, John, by putting some of his stuff into a room in the Historical Society and making it look like his den, with all the heads that the animals that he had shot. We'll get into his hunting later. And with all of his books and his chair and his lamp and his rug, there was a dead animal rug on the floor, which was an animal he'd shot. And so he put it in, but one of the Historical Society staff members began to use it as her office. And so Michael walked in the door, discovered a phone in there, and the next day a truck rolled up at the front door, and he took his toys and went home, and he was never seen again in the Historical Society. So that's where this talk started. That piqued my interest. Who is this man? Who are these people? What's going on here? What's this history all about?
Could you get a little closer to the microphone, please?
It's very difficult because I have to turn these pages, and every time I turn the page, I'm going to hit the microphone. So Mark's going to turn it up a bit, and that should help you. But thank you for saying it. Now you'll see that on the timeline that I think you've got yes, you've got a photograph. You'll see on the timeline that he was in Russia in 1917 and 18. This photograph, if you can find John Cudahy in here, I'll be very impressed. This is the Allied forces at Armenian in northern Russia at the end of the First World War, when Russia was trying to decide whether it wanted to be a socialist or communist state or continue to have royalty and the Tsars. And so the Allied forces were there to try and preserve the old guard, and they failed. So they left and came back, but he was a lieutenant. And he was out there in 1917, and he stayed, they were billeted in a small village called Toulgas, Toulgas, and he gave that as a second name for his, John gave that as his second name to his daughter. So she was Mary Toulgas. And then Cudahy, of course. Now, we'll go to the next slide. Just a minute. Next slide.
So was the United States,
I'm sorry?
was the United States actually directly involved in the Allied intervention of the?
Yes, he would have to be, otherwise he wouldn't have been able to go there as a lieutenant in the American Army. These are the Allied troops. These are all the Allied countries who joined together to try and maintain the old guard in Russia.
I didn't know that.
Okay, so this is the family scheme. This is the family tree of the Cudahys. And you'll see that it only includes the men. It doesn't include their wives and families. So you'll see down at the bottom my handwritten extra piece that Michael J. Cudahy had 4 wives. So he had 5 of his own children, 5 adopted, and 5 stepchildren as well, as a result of marrying 4 times. And his girlfriend was with him when he died. So, next slide, please.
This is my
Okay, here's our hero, looking very handsome. Later on, you'll see him looking a bit haggard, especially the last slide. Okay, next one, please. So this is the memorial in Calvary, which has the everybody else in the family is buried there from the local family. Next slide, please. This is the house on Prospect Avenue, which now is no longer there. It's 54 North Prospect. Now there's a condo building or an apartment building there. But that was the house that Patrick bought with his money at the time when John would have been growing up and going to a local school. I haven't found out which local school he went to, but he would have gone to Harvard from this building. Next slide, please. And so I thought, oh, that's easy. I lived in Harvard Square for 6 years. I'll just put a picture of Wyden Library in there because that's the library that I know that's at Harvard when we were there. We lived there in 1978 to 85. And I put this picture in thinking that represents Harvard Square, but in fact that was built 2 years after John Cudahy graduated from Harvard. That's built in 1915, he graduated in 1913. Next slide, please. So this is the most interesting slide for me in some ways. This is Campbell River, way at the top of, my map handy. Way at the top of Vancouver Island is the Campbell River map, and this picture comes from that. Campbell River's, this gives you some idea of the number of islands there are in the area. This is northern Vancouver Island. And my cousin lives on Quadra Island. So when I learned that John had been taking care of his father's timberland during his 20s, I thought to myself, well, how did he get there? Well, of course he got there the same way I got there the first time, by train. His father was on the railroad board, and he got the train from Milwaukee and he went to Seattle, which is what I had to do the first time I visited my cousins. And then he had to get the ferry across to Vancouver Island, which is a couple of hours, and then he had to get overland transport up to Campbell River, which is the only town I've ever been to other than Victoria, where I get the ferry to go to Quadra Island, and that's where Patrick Cudahy's timberland was. So this is the most extraordinary coincidence to me, that here we go, I've been to Harvard, I've lived up at Harvard, I wasn't a student there, I worked in the offices, and then here's Campbell River, so I'm beginning to feel closer and closer to this man as these things are developing. Can we have the next slide, please? So this is his wife. This is John's wife, Catherine Reed, and there's now her name is over the door of the Marquette Hall, which Michael J. Cudahy paid $1 million to have that hall named after her, built and named after her. And that's the public hall graduation takes place. I couldn't go to my graduation at Marquette because I was giving a sermon here on Christianity that morning. So the dean let me off. He said, under the circumstances, I think you should do what you're supposed to be doing, which was for a very odd reason, because there aren't many services here based on Christianity, so it was kind of funny. I was very proud of doing that. Okay, next slide, please. Hello. Here's a mic. Is there another one on? Let's put it on TV. It should be a cartoon from the newspaper.
Unfortunately, there's 2 blank slides in there, it looks like.
Okay, in that case, I will hold it up, since I have a copy of it right in my hand here. This is a cartoon from the newspaper. I don't know which newspaper it was. It says, John Cudahy, attorney. In his top pocket is a book that's called Brief. In his lower pocket is a big fat bound book called Law. In his right hand is a dead deer dripping blood, its antlers drooping. Running away in the background is a tiny little black bear running off into the distance. And right here is a tree stump that's been cut down, and that means that the cartoonist felt the same way about trees as you and I feel about trees. And he has a rifle in his hand, and he's very handsome. And this is the character sketch of prominent Wisconsin men, and it's by a cartoonist called Steele, and that was how he was seen. And this is beginning to explain some of the heads around the room in that picture of the interior.
Juliet, you need to
I'm sorry.
Speak closer to the mic.
Okay, this is the slide, another slide that you missed. I don't know why there were 2 blank slides that didn't translate. But this is him in his hunting outfit. He lived on the north side of town, lived on Swan Road, and he was a member of the Fox Hills Hunt Club, and here he is in his hunting gear with Walter Vale Johnson, who was president of several companies in the area, the son of the Johnston Bakery family, that became Masterson's Cookies, some of you might remember that. And so, back in probably the 1930s, John imported a pack of hounds, English foxhounds from England. So that would explain why we have a village called Brown Deer and a village called Fox Hills up in that area. Granville is the technical term, the name for the village up there. So that explains why he was a hunter. Now, the next slide is this one here, is Africa in 1884, because in 1928, John and a friend of his who lived in Chicago, but they both grew up in Milwaukee, and they both visited the Milwaukee Public Museum as children, and were very deeply fond of it. And I had worked there too, so I'm invested in MPM as well. And they went, excuse me, on a collecting expedition which they partially paid for. It's very interesting. Local people, local companies in this area provided tents, provided eating utensils, provided cots, provided all kinds of things for the expedition. In 1928, If you look at the way top of Africa, you'll see the Mediterranean and the coastline of France, and that's where Marseille is, and they all met in Marseille. And the next slide, you'll see the people who went on the group. So this is from the left to the right, John Cudahy on the way left, the tallest one. Then Cardiff Wells, James Clark, Samuel Barrett, who was the president of the Public Museum, and Leslie Carlisle. And then also Owen Grommy went on this expedition. You might remember him as being a wildlife artist. He started out as a taxidermist because, as you know, if you kill an animal and you want to put it on show, you have to empty it and fill it up with things that will last. So that's what they brought them back for the Africa exhibit. So they brought back spears and shields and all kinds of things they traded for and bought and so on. So it would have been 1928, it would have been a very exciting trip for John as a hunter. And he stayed with them for about 5 weeks. And then he went off to Belgium to hunt with King Leopold in Europe. So it would have been in the Bavarian forest and around there. So next slide, please. This is Africa as she is now. And so you can imagine them, they crossed the Mediterranean, they went down through the Red Sea, and you'll see at the bottom of the Red Sea, you'll see the orange color to the right, which is now Yemen, and then they crossed over that small opening to the Suez, to the Straits there, and you'll see that there's a very tiny tip of the Horn of Africa, which is Djibouti. And in 1928, the population would have been about 15,000 people. It's currently 1.1 million people. And so it's a big old trading port, very important, so much stuff goes through there, so many people go across the straits and so on. They went down further, they went down to Tanzania, which used to be Tanganyika when they were doing it. Now, I have to say, I did read the account of this expedition. I drove down to Parkside University and I got the book there. It's written by Samuel Barrett, the person who directed the Public Museum at that time. And it's very exciting reading about the trip to Africa. But one of the problems is that they were gung-ho hunters. And they didn't have much regard for the people, if you can imagine that, in 1928. So I was reading through the book and the history was interesting. And then I came to a photograph of one of the bearers who would have carried their stuff. And underneath the photograph it said, "Fuzzy Wuzzy number 1. And a few pages later there was Fuzzy Wuzzy number 2. So I closed the book and I drove home and I never finished reading it, and I think you'll forgive me for that. Here is something from Jumbo Land, the story of the exciting expedition. And I just want to read a little bit from it for you. On the ship coming from Africa was a Rhodesian who'd been chased by an enraged elephant, but he would have little talk about it. It was like a careering motor truck, possessed of the devil and bent upon killing you, he described his experience, shifted the subject in that way soldiers have, of steering away from the harrowing recollection of battle scenes. So we never learned whether he escaped scot-free or had been mauled and scrambled as Carl Ackley was when his wife found him and nursed him, expiring wreck that he was, back to life again. And in that connection, when you hear of aviators riddled with bullets and crashing 2,400 feet to earth, jockeys going down beneath the trampling melee of frenzied horses at Beecher's Brook in the Grand National, maniacs hurled out of speed automobiles racing 200 miles an hour, people in the more useful ways of life falling from the third-story window or crushed in railway collisions, and all not only surviving experiences but passing them off lightly as incidents in a busy career. That's the flavour of an expedition in 1928. He was a man of his times. He was a hunter. He was going to shoot a lion. which they brought back and stuffed and mounted. So I have to forgive him because I talk about him enthusiastically in many other regards. But this is an episode that I'm not proud of in his life, I must say. And here is Barbara Robertson's book about the origin of Samson and Sambo, Simba and Timber. And this is from, I just bought this at the Public Museum a few months ago. And here is Dr. Barrett with a lion cub that they brought back with them. And probably most of you know the story of the lion cub that lived on the roof of the combined library and museum building for several years until it got tooth problems from eating the wrong food and had to go to the zoo and be cared for. After which, then it was, when it died, it came back to the museum stuffed, of course, so that's how things go. Okay, so that's the end of that. Let's go to the next slide.
Got a blank one again, Juliet.
Another blank.
Anybody else that says no ad?
This is actually a picture of a newspaper article describing after he came back from the expedition in the early 1930s, he was interested in doing something diplomatic. He loved traveling and so on. And as Mike tells it in his book here, John Cudahy loved politics and ran for Milwaukee alderman, state senator and lieutenant governor without success. But with Franklin Roosevelt's election in 1932, opportunity knocked. Helped by his generous campaign contribution to FDR, John Cudahy met Jim Farley, who I just saw on television being interviewed in an old piece of footage, FDR's campaign manager and a fellow Irishman. Pay attention to this. Farley said to my father, "Don't worry, John, I'll get you in." And boom, next thing you know, he was ambassador to Poland. With his wife Catherine and family in tow, John Cudahy went to Warsaw, a god-forsaken place in those days, dark and cold and still devastated from World War I. So here is what was said in the newspaper. Major Hone was represented at the speaker's table by his secretary John Granville. Postmaster Peter Piasecki was there. Judge John Kletzger and John Carroll. Local dignitaries, in other words. "It is my cherished ambition," he said, "to be taken to the bosom of the people of the Republic of Poland, whom I've always admired. I went to visit Poland's great capital, the sacred shrines of her famous dead. I want to visit the seats of learning, to mingle with the people in the streets, learning their hopes and aspirations. It is my hope I shall form an acquaintance with the great men of Poland." Great men. Those were the times. He became friends with great men. And the next slide, if you have something, there we go. Off he goes to Poland in his very fancy dress outfit. So, again, good wishes are sent. Oops. We're on to an Irish harp already.
There was
Okay.
a blank slide in between.
There was nothing in between.
No.
Okay, so we're going to jump from that article of Poland. The civic leaders, let me see that. When they saw him off, they gave him a banquet at the Fista. Then Europe at the time, the selection of the representative of 120 million people.
Juliet, you need to get closer to the mic.
Selection of the representative of 150 million people is a very important responsibility and should be treated with great care, said Senator Duffy in his speech. And so this was America abroad. This was the representative of America in Europe. So you may be familiar with this picture. We all know what this picture stands for, right? This is the harp. As it turns out, it's a trademark of a famous drink. My grandfather was the private architect to the owner of the Guinness Company. So again, I found another connection with myself, which kind of reinforces. I'm supposed to be talking about this man, which is kind of funny. Guinness was founded in 1759, the year George Frederick Handel died. And the Messiah was first played in Dublin, I think in 1742. A familiar trademark that we're all familiar with, and that's because he became minister to Ireland. Now, there should be, what's the next slide? Let's see if we've got something. Lord. There he is that's on his way to Belgium, actually. So that's afterwards. Okay, so I'm sorry that the slides aren't working out, because they're all on the USB that I gave to be put in the situation. But anyway, this is the Irish Constitution. I gave this talk at the Irish Centre on Wisconsin Avenue, and I downloaded the entire Constitution. It's 37 pages long, and it's very, very tiny, tiny print. But I printed it out to have it handy because John was ambassador to Ireland as his second ambassadorship. And I just want to read you the preamble. Come in, sit down. This is the very first statement in the Irish Constitution from 1937 that John Cudahy helped to put together. Ireland is a sovereign, independent, democratic state. The Irish language is the national language, the first official language. The English language is recognized as the second official language. So that, they dedicate, the whole state is dedicated to God. Okay, this is the preamble. In the name of the most holy Trinity, from whom is all authority, and to whom, as our final end, all actions of both men and states must be referred, we the people of Era, humbly acknowledging all our obligations to our divine Lord Jesus Christ, who sustained our fathers through centuries of trial, gratefully remembering their heroic and unremitting struggle to regain the rightful independence of our nation, and seeking to promote the common good, with due observance of prudence, justice, and charity, so that the dignity and freedom of the individual may be assured, true social order attained, the unity of our country restored, and concord established with other nations, do hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves the Constitution. Irish Catholic, very, very welcome in Ireland as the American ambassador. It was right up their alley. They were deeply happy. And you'll see a little map of Ireland in between the book and the portrait down here on this stand. And you might see an arrow pointing towards where the Cudahy family came from. When he was ambassador, they welcomed him. So here's Ireland, and it's way down here. The name of the village was Callan, where Patrick came from. And so, let's see, the Anglo-Irish Trade Agreement was put together in 1938. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, famous for believing Hitler, who he shouldn't have done, summarised the areas for discussion in a debate on the ERA Bill held in 1938. The first was the question of partition, the second of defence, the third finance, and the fourth trade. And so that's what John Cudahy was dealing with at the time. Okay, we're certainly jumping around in these slides now. We've missed a slide of Louvain. When John took his next ambassadorship, he was offered, after Ireland, he was offered Belgium. And this is a picture of Louvain having been bombed. So my father was in the RAF and he was a navigator on a bomber. So I don't know what campaigns he was involved in, but that was what people did in those days, and we're still doing it, still bombing people. So this picture is taken as a result of John coming back home to Milwaukee, having written to the president to ask to be relieved of duties because he went to Belgium to be ambassador in January of 1940 and he watched the Nazis roll in. They came by planes in groups, they came on foot, they came in tanks, they came on horseback, they came right through Belgium. As you know, that was the soft border where the Maginot Line allowed for Belgium to be a bridge between France and Germany, and Hitler just went right through it. So he saw this happening and he asked to be relieved of his duties, which, you know, the president was only too glad to relieve him of those and say that he needed to come home. So I want to read to you from his letter from February 1940. Dear Mr. President, the Spanish ambassador left here this morning with the intention of proposing to General Franco that the Spanish ambassador in Berlin approach Hitler and ask him the terms on which he would enter into peace negotiations at this time. If proposals capable of discussion were forthcoming, the Spanish ambassadors in Paris and London would approach the French and British governments with a view to arranging a peace conference. The ambassador asked me about your attitude. I assured him that while you could not possibly make any commitment without some knowledge of the suggested effort, your whole-souled sympathy was in the direction of peace. I reminded him of your persuasive influence at the time of Munich, and how ever since the outbreak of the war you had repeatedly expressed your willingness to explore any feasible method for ending the conflict. If you remember at this point, you were still on the fence. The majority opinion of the diplomatic colleagues is that both from the viewpoint of morale and from economic necessity, Germany must attack this spring and force a military decision. The crucial question is the supply of fuel oil in Germany, and from all the evidence I can gather, this is inadequate, even if military operations are confined to their present tempo to last over a year. Even with greatly increased supplies coming from Russia and Romania, there is no possibility of Germany having sufficient oil to last beyond a year, therefore an offensive must be staged before next fall, and this should logically be timed as soon as the weather permits traction for motorized military units. I believe we will see action this spring or early summer for the reasons given, but I know there are many who oppose this opinion and are sure that there will never be any military offensive, but that Germany will be content to wage a war of attrition, in which it will be bound to prevail just as it was prevailing against France and Great Britain in 1916-17. The next letter that you're not seeing a picture of is a handwritten one to his wife. Dearest Kathy, this is handwritten, so it's not easy to read, forgive me. In great confidence, I want to tell you that I expect to be home sometime this summer. This is March the 25th, 1940. That is the present prospect. Of course, if the war comes this way, all may be different. No diplomatic wives are allowed to travel to Europe, except under exceptional circumstances. Those who are here, such as Margaret Biddle, will be at the outbreak of war. I have personally been urging all Americans to leave Belgium, so it could hardly be right if you came in the back door while they go out the front door. I think you would like Brussels, and I would give a great deal to have you here with me, so you can see what he was dealing with. So the next exciting thing is this picture here, which is a picture of Berchtesgaden and its relationship to Austria. I've been to Berchtesgaden, and I haven't been to the Eagle's Nest, but the view from the Eagle's Nest is over the mountains into Austria. Hitler wanted to see his homeland from his little eyrie that he had. Now, there weren't any beds there, nobody ever stayed there overnight. He only went there about 5 times. But when John Cudahy came back to Milwaukee, he was very disturbed about what was going on. And what was he going to do in Milwaukee? He'd been gone all this time. He'd been overseas all these years, several years in Poland, several years in Ireland, several months in Belgium. What's he going to do in Milwaukee? He doesn't have a job. Is he going to go back to real estate with his dad, like they put Cudahy Towers together and manage lots of real estate? Is he going to go back to being a lawyer? Was he going to go hunting again? I don't think so, not after all this time. He's in his late 40s. And so he gets in touch with a friend in New York who works for Life magazine. And he says, I just think Americans have no idea what's going on over there. What on earth can I do to raise people's attention? So what does his friend suggest? Why don't you get scoop of the century? Why don't you go and interview Hitler? So that's what he did. Comfortable in Europe, travel, use the language, no problem. So he interviews him at the Eagle's Nest in Berchtesgaden. And my best friend lives in the next village, my best friend from high school, so I've actually seen it. It's the most bizarre connection to have all of these things in common with this man. But this is the actual interview. When it was published, the president was absolutely furious. You can't have a private citizen interviewing a foreign leader when your relationship with his country is ill-defined. We were not at war. Nobody had decided what Britain was. I would have been, but Americans were still not friends. It was so embarrassing. So John was persona non grata. It's like he couldn't talk to anybody anyway. But at the back of that book, Joy Works, which is in all the public libraries, is his interview with Hitler, which I have copies of here, but it's the last chapter. It's an appendix in Michael's book about his own career. And I don't think I'm going to read you pieces of this. You can find out about it from taking a look yourself in the book, which you can get from the public library easily enough. I'm just trying to find out anything else you've missed, but that may be. Yes, when he came back to Milwaukee after the interview with Hitler, he was offered the opportunity to be head of defense, and so they're all blank before this slide.
I'm sorry.
There weren't any slides before this
No,
one?
nothing in between there.
Well, one of them would have been a picture of him in the newspaper as he takes office as head of state defense, which he was offered. But he didn't live very long after that. It was 1943, and he died in his 50s. And the next slide that you would have seen is a picture of the people walking behind the coffin. And I can read you from the newspaper from the Milwaukee Sentinel, 10th of September 1943. Burial rites for John Cudahy, former envoy in the diplomatic service and director of the State Defense Council, were conducted Thursday at St. Robert's Catholic Church in Shorewood. Friends and associates of Mr. Cudahy were pallbearers. They are left to right, Federal Judge Ephraim Duffy, Charles O'Hara, Vice President of Cudahy Brothers Company, William Brock Fuller, investment broker, O&C E-Line, and Edward Cudahy, Chicago Pampa, and James Crittenden, Secretary-Treasurer of the banking firm here. Cudahy, by the way, has a street named after him, and 24 other roads in Cudahy City are named for different meat packers. 25 streets in one village, and one of them is right next to my street that I live on, and that's Lipton Street. And so my next talk in the year will be on Lipton. The tea guy, who started out life as he was a grocer, so that's kind of interesting. So that's what you missed in the slides, and I'm sorry they didn't come through because I had them and reloaded them, and I don't know what happened, there just was a missed connection there. So, I hope that you found that interesting. This man had an extraordinary career. I'm deeply fond of him, having never met him, and I'm glad to know where Michael is buried now, because at least I know that somebody at Forest Home will be giving a talk about his life. And so they may include his famous father, who's not very famous because he didn't spend much time in Milwaukee. He was overseas so much of his adult life. He went away to Harvard, then he went away to Madison for law school, then he got all these different jobs overseas, you know, the Public Museum, and then the 3 ambassadorships and so on. So that's why we haven't heard much about him. He didn't spend much time here. And I don't know if his mansion is still in Granville, but the land became the YMCA, and it's currently under discussion to be sold for development into housing. And that's at Swan Road, on the way up to Macquarie. So that's what I have to offer, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Questions? You can contact me through the church membership portal if you want to follow up with any of your further questions. Thank you very much.